All right, tonight we're back in Nehemiah. And we're starting chapter 5. Nehemiah chapter 5. All right, recall now that they've had persecution. They've had threats. They've had intimidation. They've had ridicule. They've had all of these different forms of persecution. The enemy is outside the gates, and the devil is out there with them. But the devil's slick, ain't he? He's not never satisfied with one method. He has several methods at his disposal. And we got a taste of that the last time when it said that the men of Judah complained about the rocks and stuff in the way. So there was some inside trouble coming on. And now we've come to another set where another set of trouble raises its head. Now you talk about frustrating. When people start complaining, they don't work. Okay? When they don't work, the job's not getting done. And therefore, it's just a big hoorah instead of something being accomplished for the Lord. So the devil's real subtle, and he had the enemy laughing at him first. And then the opposition was on the outside. Now there's going to be some opposition come up from within. And that's usually how the devil strikes his hardest blow, is from within. Okay? Within the walls, there were supposed to be brothers and sisters. There were supposed to be Jews of the tribes there working for God and for the glory of God and for his city. All right? They're supposed to get along. They're supposed to put aside any kind of differences and do the work and labor for the Lord. But look what happens now. Let's read it in verses 1 through 4 of Nehemiah 5. And there was a great cry of the people and of their wives against their brethren the Jews. All right? So what's that tell you? What does it mean, a great cry? Right? And crying out to Nehemiah. All right? Kind of like a football stadium. What do you hear when you get around close to it? Boy, they're hollering and ranting and raving, carrying on, going crazy. Well, this is what's going on in Nehemiah's time, only it's all directed towards him. There was a great cry, not just a little fussing, not just a little murmuring and backbiting, but a great big, almost riot-like situation. And look what it's about. Of the people and of their wives against their brethren, the Jews. All right? So the devil has come in and discouraged many. And now, because he couldn't get anywhere with that, he's going to step farther on the inside and going to get trouble started in the area of taxes. All right? Taxes. Everybody know what tax is, right? We're all used to taxes. But back then, taxes were extremely exorbitant. All right? Because who would you be supporting? In your government, who would you be supporting? The king, right? If you're a Jew, you'd be supporting your king. Or you would be supporting the king that's got you under his control. So taxes would be high because it took a lot of money for the king to live. He had all kinds of fancy stuff, all kinds of fancy food, all kinds of fancy servants, and then also he had to pay for his armies, etc., etc., etc. So there would be a great need for taxes. And taxes never went down. Where do they always go? Have you ever seen when taxes went down in your federal government? No. They're always going to be there, and they will surely always increase as long as we have taxes. Now look what it says in verse 2. It says, For there were that said, We, our sons and our daughters, are many. Therefore we take up corn for them, that we may eat and live. All right? What are they saying? Got a big family to feed. Okay? We have many sons and daughters. We've got families to feed. So it's natural to have those kind of problems when you don't have the supplies to feed everybody. Now, if you stop and think about it, they wouldn't have time to raise corn, would they? If they're walking on the wall, 12, 14 hours a day, when are you going to plant corn? So they're trying to feed their families. And what's the first thing that you do if you don't have money to buy what you need? What's usually the first thing you do? You either sell what you got or you start borrowing money. Okay? They start borrowing money. Now look what it says. Some also there were what that said, we have mortgaged our lands, our vineyards, and houses that we might buy corn because of the dearth. So there's still a famine going on. And he says, we took loans on our land. And that's common practice today, isn't it? You go out and you want to build a house, you got to borrow some money, and you got to have land to put that house on. So here now they're saying we've had to go borrow money against our property to pay for food. All right, now I'll look at verse 4. There were also that said, we have borrowed money for the king's tribute, and that upon our lands and vineyards. So they had to get a lien to borrow the money to pay their taxes. So when you put a bunch of liens on your property, what's going to happen sooner or later? All right, the tax man's going to come around and collect. You got everything mortgaged, you got tax liens out on your property, you're looking at losing your property. Look at verse 5. Yet now our flesh is as the flesh of our brethren, our children as their children, and lo, we bring into bondage our sons and our daughters to be servants, and some of our daughters are brought into bondage already. Neither is it in our power to redeem them, for other men have our lands and vineyards. All right, what's he saying? It's right. They're selling their children into slavery as servants. And it says some of them have already been exchanged. In other words, we've already lost some sons and daughters in servitude. We've had to sell them, and it's already been done. So things are getting kind of rough, aren't they? Things are getting bad. Now that's hard to deal with. You stop and think about it. So they had to go out and buy stuff. They had to buy their food. They had to buy their clothing. They had to do all that. And they didn't have a lot to start with, because remember, when they came to there, where were they coming from? Where were the Jews coming from? Babylon, right? And all the other places that Babylon put them. But also, what was their positions there in Babylon? Slaves. Most of them were slaves in hard labor. Now, as a slave, how much money you got? If you have any, you don't have much. So the slaves wouldn't have a whole lot of money, so they probably just got the clothes on their back, the shoes on their feet, if that. And they're working hard. They're working hard to build the wall. They're working day and night, all the way up till the stars come out, it says. So they're working long hours, and they're having to pull guard duty. So they don't have time to go out and buy food. So they come up with the solution, well, we'll borrow money on our land. And then some of the brother Jews and all these were taking advantage of that. The richer ones would start loaning money out. Now say, you sign the lien over on your land, and we'll give you some money. That ought to last you. And it looks real good for a little while, but then when that money starts going down again, what are you going to do? Go get more or lose your land. So it's a catch-22. Now, this is what's happening, and here's this great cry out to Nehemiah. They're all in debt now. They're debtors, and they're passing that debt on to their sons and daughters and having to sell their sons and daughters into slavery. Well, Ashley, how would you like to be sold into slavery so your mom and daddy could eat? Wouldn't be good, would it? But it was necessary back then. It was necessary for them to do it. So you think about it, now the devil's got another handle on them. If you're upset about having to pay taxes and having to buy food without any money, You're going to starve to death sooner or later, aren't you? Unless God intervenes. You see, they're looking physically, and they came up with these solutions without God's telling them so. They went and started borrowing money instead of waiting on God. They should have been fasting and praying and seeking God to fulfill their needs. God could have sent them manna again if He wanted to. God could have sent them fresh water, manna. He could have sent them some quail too if they wanted it. God can provide, but they started this borrowing business, and no doubt there were of their brethren the Jews some that were lending, and they were getting richer and richer, while the others were getting poorer and poorer. Doesn't sound good, does it?
That's their own people.
Right, that's their own people they're taking advantage of. Okay? So they were mortgaging their land. The ones that held the mortgages would say, okay, where's my money? You got to pay me. And that money's done run out. So what are you going to do? Well, I've got a son here or a daughter here. I guess you can have them in payment for the debt. And they take them. Okay? And then they'd be in slavery or servitude. How long? You remember? 7 years. That was the price. 7 years for servitude. At the end of that 7 years, you had to let them loose. And of course, they kind of worked some ways around that. And if you wanted to stay, what did they do to you if you wanted to stay as a servant to that master? Remember the procedure? Put your ear on the doorpost, and they would take an awl. They give you an ear piercing for sure. That wouldn't feel good, would it? But they were willing to stay there at the master. They liked the master. They liked the place they stayed. They liked what they were doing. They said, hey, I ain't going nowhere. I'm staying right here. But that's the problem. If you're a servant, you're obeying the whim of your master, whatever it is. You're subject to him. And so here are the sons and daughters getting traded off for food, basically, or to keep the land so they can start growing back again. Now remember, what had happened to the land before they were exiled? What had been happening? Well, they got burned out, but before that, what was happening? They were getting hungry. There was a dearth upon the land before they got exiled. So the land wasn't in good shape when they left. Now, if you've ever left a piece of property for a little while and come back to it, what you usually see? Right, it's growed up. The weeds and the thorns and the briars and the trees that fell and all that stuff. It takes a lot of work to keep a piece of property up. And of course, that's not to mention the fact that the raiders, when they came in, they burned everything. They tore everything down. Nothing's in order anymore. You have to start from scratch, rebuilding your place. So not only are these people rebuilding their walls, but they're rebuilding their homes too. Okay? While they're no doubt, I don't think them fathers were going home to their families, and they would go home and say, all right, let's lay a few more rocks tonight before we sit down and eat or before we sit down and go to bed. Before we do that, let's lay a few more rocks in our house wall so that we can get things in order. And they would have to do it a rock at a time. And then sooner or later, with a rock at a time, you're going to get it done. So this is a hardship. And it's a hardship that's part of it self-induced because they came up with worldly solutions. And my suggestion is that if the Lord's telling you to do something, do it. And he will provide. Trust in the Lord. Don't trust in your own devices. Trust in the Lord. And that's what the point is of this lesson here, is they began to have this problem, and it's going to boil. Okay? Because they're having to pay taxes, and they're having to buy food. Now, they don't think that they should have to, but they do in order to live. So they didn't wait on God, and they went ahead and did this. And look at verse 6 just real quick. We won't go into it much. And I was very angry when I heard their cry and these words. So how did Nehemiah react? He's mad. He's mad at that the solution they come up with of bartering for taxes and for food. He's mad at them for the solution that they came up with, putting their sons and daughters into servitude. He's mad at them. He's angry for what they came up with and did. This was no way to conduct business without seeking the Lord or asking for help. What did James say about help? It says, you have not because you ask not, and you ask amiss. So when when Nehemiah finds out about it, his reaction is anger. It's wrong. Wait a minute, it's wrong. You shouldn't be doing that. If you needed food, you should have told me, and I'd have made some arrangements, because I don't have any doubt Nehemiah could have ordered a wagon load or two for food and have it brought there from the king's place. I'm sure he could have. They could have brought a whole wagon train full of food for them if they had let Nehemiah know what's going on in their houses. But you see, Nehemiah didn't know, and he got upset. Now that's enough to get you in trouble right there. When you get angry, you can make mistakes, can't you? You can start losing your progress and start slipping back a little bit. So the devil's really got into the heyday now. He's really got into the woodshed, and he's tearing up that woodshed. People are getting mad. They're getting ready to fight. They're going to blame everybody. They're going to blame the Jews that are getting rich. They're going to blame the Jews that are getting poor. They're going to blame Nehemiah for all this happening. So it's getting to be a boiling pot, and it's simmering up right now. And Nehemiah's reached the boiling point. He says, and when I heard these words and their cry, I was angry. So we're going to leave Nehemiah angry tonight and take up next week, Lord willing, with what he plans to do about this situation. First of all, what's the first thing he has to do? Not be angry. Okay? You got to get that out. Get it done. And then begin to think rationally without anger involved. That's the key to solving a lot of your problems. Get rid of that anger, then you're free to communicate with God and lift up your needs to the Lord. But if you're angry and try to talk to the Lord, it doesn't work too good. So you got to get rid of that anger and deal with it, and then begin to find your resources, which is turning to the Lord and get them. So we'll take up there with verse number 6 and go on down to the next few verses from here. All right, let's all stand. We'll close with a word of prayer, and we'll be dismissed. Father in heaven, we do thank you. Thank you for your love, your mercy, your grace. Thank you for providing for us. Thank you, Father, for giving us ways of solving our problems, and that is through you. Lord, help us to ever remember to seek you first, and all these other things will be added unto us. Lord, help us to rely upon your strength, your ability, and your provisions. Now bless us as we go forth. Help us to stand strong for you. Help us to be a light for you. We ask these things in the name of our Savior, we do pray. Amen.